Come with me to Washington, D.C. It's a random evening of no particular note. The locals are going about their business. Most are coming home from work or sitting on the stoop, minding their own business. Let's imagine we're somewhere near a small, open-air drug market, of the sort that is common in almost any major or medium-sized city in America. All of a sudden, gunshots ring out. Everyone scatters. Where did the shots come from? Did someone call the police? Perhaps not. But we no longer need to wonder. District of Columbia Police have a program called ShotSpotter, which is a network of audio microphones that covers about 1/4 of the federal district. In a study of the program, the Urban Institute noted 336 incidents of gunfire during one recent school day, more than half of which took place within 1,000 feet of a school. Many were unreported. The DC program uses software filters to distinguish between gunshots and other similar sounds, such as the backfire of an automobile or a jackhammer on a city street. With the use of multiple microphones, the Capitol ShotSpotter program can triangulate the location of the gunfire and give responding police officers a very precise location within minutes of the event. Today, dozens of police forces around the United States use the same technology. We can learn a lot from the ShotSpotter data. For example, a surprising number of shots are fired in celebration. Before the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, ShotSpotter microphones around the United States picked up more than 1,000 different gunshots in a 6-hour window, accounting for 1/4 of the total fired that entire month. We also know that residents in Miami sometimes shoot into the air to mark victories by the National Basketball Association's Miami Heat. Perhaps of even greater value, we know how frequently gunshots are actually reported to the law enforcement authorities. If we cross-check the number of shots detected by ShotSpotter with the number of reports, we can infer that gunfire might go unreported up to 80% of the time. In other words, only 1 in 5 of all gunshots might be getting reported to the police. The audio evidence from ShotSpotter is also good in trials. It can establish how many guns were fired, in what order, and from which direction. That might tell us who fired first, for example. Of course, there are some complaints. Many police departments don't have the resources to respond to every gunshot. And the system is not perfect. There are a number of false positives out there. That is, something that sounds like gunfire, but might not be. We don't know for sure. For example, on Long Island, New York, the Suffolk Police Department has said that only 7% of the shots it detects on its ShotSpotter system can be affirmatively verified as having actually occurred. However, over time, the number and probably the audio fidelity of gunshot microphones is going to increase. And that will certainly give the police a better sense of where gunshots are typically heard and who or what might be their underlying causes. The nationwide rollout of gunshot microphones is the reflection of a much bigger trend. And that is because of the unsung and little appreciated reality that local police departments are the biggest collectors of surveillance data, much more on a volume basis than even the National Security Agency. In general, we seem to care less about the use of surveillance technology by police. It doesn't excite nearly the same attention and concern as does the same activity conducted by the federal government. In some instances, like the use of body cameras, we actually want the police to collect more information than they do now. Why is that? What is it about police surveillance that garners less attention than intelligence-related surveillance? And are we making a mistake by not focusing on it more? Those are some of the questions I want to address in this lecture. So let me begin by offering a speculative answer. I say speculative because it reflects my own instincts about these questions, rather than any hard data. I think that the reason we typically are less worried about police data collection is that we have the perception that the police generally don't aggregate or massage the information. The local police tend to use data retrospectively to solve crimes, rather than prospectively to prevent crimes or terrorism. For the police, the predictive function of intelligence gathering seems yet to lie in the future. And that might be a mistaken assumption, as we'll get to in a bit. We also think of police activity as being resource constrained. See, even if the police have optical character readers scanning every license plate, a local force that has only 6 patrol cars probably won't be hot on your trail anytime soon. In the meantime, the immediate benefits of increased surveillance capabilities seem apparent. Crime is more easily solved. The potential for abuse is real, but we have an instinctive view that it is perhaps not often realized. As we go through this lecture, let's examine how realistic that sense is. So we're going to proceed in 4 steps. First, let's look at one case of police surveillance gone awry, just to remind ourselves that surveillance abuse comes in many forms. Then, we'll look at the most prevalent forms of police surveillance today, the use of video cameras for anti-crime surveillance and license plate readers, which are used for more prosaic things, such as enforcement of red lights and speed limits. Third, we will look at the newest issue of police surveillance, body cameras, and some of the privacy issues that they pose. And then to close the lecture, I'll tell you a little bit about how the New York Police Department, the largest in the nation, is pulling all of its data together. The subject of surveillance inherently raises the delicate balance between capabilities that are potentially useful, but which are also capable of being abused when put to the wrong purposes. My general thesis in this course is that technology and surveillance techniques are essentially neutral. For instance, drones and biometrics can each be put to beneficial use or be used in ways that American citizens would not approve of. The same thing is true of police surveillance techniques. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the New York Police Department, joined by veteran CIA officers, built an intelligence gathering program with the goal of mapping the New York region's ethnic communities and using undercover officers to keep tabs on Muslims, where they shopped, where they ate, and where they prayed. It was known as the Demographics Unit. The Police Demographics Unit used census information in government databases to create a map of ethnic neighborhoods in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Undercover agents, who were known as rakers, then went to these neighborhoods with the idea of chatting up the locals to determine their ethnicity and their sentiments. For example, rakers were present in Pakistani communities in the immediate aftermath of American drone attacks in Pakistan for the apparent purpose of listening for anti-American rhetoric and reaction to the attacks. The Demographics Unit is also said to have tracked Muslim students in colleges across the Northeast. One example of their efforts was the so-called Moroccan Initiative, a formerly secret program that kept tabs on Moroccan neighborhoods. It was begun after suicide bombings killed 45 people in the Moroccan city of Casablanca in 2003, and after Moroccan terrorists were linked to the 2004 train bombing in Madrid, Spain. New York police put people, including U.S. citizens, under surveillance and cataloged where they ate, worked, and prayed. Almost all of this sort of surveillance is legal. The police can, for example, loiter outside of a particular shop and catalog everyday life in a community. If one feels spooked or chilled by this activity, it is not, as Paul Shavigny, a law professor at New York University, says, an injury that is recognized in a court of law. The general actions of people in a community are open and public, and not generally protected by the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. The challenge of judging these sorts of programs is compounded by the fact that New York's counterintelligence efforts have also been at the core of many of its most successful anti-terrorist programs. The exact degree of success is hotly disputed, but it's undeniable that the NYPD Intelligence Division was, for example, responsible for disrupting a 2004 plot to bomb the Herald Square subway station in Manhattan. And so, even though scrutiny of Muslim Americans, simply because they are Muslims, seems to be at odds with America's egalitarian principles, some want programs like this to continue. The New York Police Department's so-called Moroccan Initiative became public a decade after the 9/11 attacks. And today it reminds us that police capabilities can sometimes be deployed in ways that are inappropriate, even if they're not, strictly speaking, unlawful. If I had to say what the most prevalent form of police surveillance is today, it would be fixed surveillance cameras, or closed-circuit TV, known by its acronym CCTV, and their close cousins, license plate readers. The United Kingdom has nearly 6 million of the closed-circuit TVs scattered around the country, roughly 1 for every 11 people in the entire nation. That's an awful lot of cameras. And there can be little doubt that these cameras are effective tools, at least for some purposes. This is especially so for retrospective investigations. When a crime has occurred, surveillance video that has been taken and stored can be pulled up and analyzed. For example, after 4 Muslim terrorists detonated bombs in London's underground and on a bus back in July 2005, the suspects were quickly identified from CCTV footage taken at Luton Station, where they had entered the subway system. The London attacks also demonstrated another important aspect of the proliferation of CCTV. Most of the video is maintained by private sector actors rather than by the government. Soon after the 4 suspected attackers were identified in London, the UK authorities were able to backtrack their movements over the days prior to the attack. CCTV footage, for example, showed one of the men arguing with a cashier at a gas station, contending that he'd been shortchanged. Other video seemed to suggest that the bombers had done a dry run through the underground as a means of reconnaissance in the days preceding the attack. Nor was this London experience unique. After the tragic bombing at the Boston Marathon in 2013, a key piece of evidence was from a CCTV camera operated by a department store across the street. This camera showed an attacker leaving a black backpack next to a mailbox in the precise location of the explosion. But do CCTV cameras work prospectively? That is, do they reduce crime by deterring bad conduct? You might think that the answer would be yes, based on the theory that surveillance cameras would deter potential offenders. That, after all, is the insight of Plato's ring of Gyges, the idea that a ring of invisibility would eliminate deterrence and encourage aberrant behavior. However, the actual evidence is mixed. Take London, for example. There, the cameras are so plentiful that they are called a ring of steel around the city center. But many residents question the effectiveness of London's system. Only 1 crime was solved for every 1,000 cameras deployed, according to a police report from one recent year. At the same time, CCTV cameras were costing authorities hundreds of millions of dollars a year, according to the civil liberties group Big Brother Watch. In the United States, the Urban Institute reviewed the use of CCTV in 3 cities, Baltimore, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., in its report evaluating the use of surveillance cameras for crime control and prevention. Its findings were, well, confusing. In Baltimore, public surveillance cameras installed in the 50-block City Watch section reduced violent crime by 23% between 2003 and 2008, according to the report. By contrast, in Chicago, where cameras were put into 2 communities, only one saw a reduction in crime, while there was no visible effect in the other. And Washington, D.C. seems to have identified no appreciable change in criminality after the cameras were installed whatsoever. Supporters of CCTV usage will tell you that the reason cameras didn't work in D.C. is because of the privacy and civil liberties restrictions placed on them, restrictions that the community as a whole thought were essential. Here's what the Urban Institute said. District residents were outspoken about their concerns that neighborhood cameras would be misused and that they threatened citizens' rights to privacy. The City Council held open hearings for the public and interest groups and designed camera guidelines based on their input. Those guidelines prohibit monitors from viewing flyers that are being distributed or targeting cameras on people based on their race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or other characteristics. The cameras can only be monitored from one control center, and a police officer at the rank of lieutenant or higher must be in the room. Up to 2 officers serve as monitors on each shift, with one usually watching 4 or 5 cameras at a time, while the other works with crime alert technology in the room. Now, opponents will tell you that it is more than just surveillance. It's the prospect of its pervasiveness that scares them. Civil liberties activists are concerned about how the technology could be abused. Imagine, for example, cameras in far-flung cities all connecting to the same database, so that a person's movements could be tracked across the states, maybe to follow a political protester instead of a terrorist. Jennifer Lynch, an attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, says, "We like to think we have some privacy in our lives, that we can go places that we don't necessarily want the government to know about. What concerns me is that if all of these cameras get linked together at some point, and if we apply facial recognition on the back end, we'll be able to track people wherever they go." Analyst Farhad Manju of the Slate website recognizes another factor worth considering when we think about CCTVs: the trade-offs in surveillance and security systems. He says, "We've turned most public spaces into fortresses now. It's impossible for you to get into tall buildings, airports, many museums, concerts, and even public celebrations without being subjected to pat-downs and metal detectors. When combined with competent law enforcement, surveillance cameras are more effective, less intrusive, less psychologically draining, and much more pleasant than these alternatives." So now let's talk briefly about license plate readers. These are fixed cameras that have only a single object of interest: tracking vehicles. The technology for this is actually pretty old school. Optical character readers are used to translate the image or picture of the license plate into a text that can be easily read and stored. Most of what happens with respect to collecting license plates is unregulated. After all, the police could sit at a toll plaza and write the plate number down by hand, so there really is no readily apparent privacy concern. The privacy interest arises when the collection becomes pervasive and systematic. And that's exactly what's happening. The Wall Street Journal reported that the Justice Department was building a national database to track in real time the movement of vehicles around the United States. The program is said to have begun, innocently enough, with an initial focus on tracking cars along the southwest border to follow the movements of drugs and drug money. It was housed at the El Paso Intelligence Center in Texas, a law enforcement intelligence center that staffed 24 hours a day. But today, the program is national in scope. And the Department of Homeland Security has its own database. U.S. Customs and Border Patrol personnel collect information on land border traffic, amounting to hundreds of millions of license plates. New York City itself has long collected the license plate of every car entering or leaving Manhattan. Now, perhaps that doesn't concern you. You might be of the "I have nothing to hide" view. Jay Stanley, a senior policy analyst at the American Civil Liberties Union, reminds us, however, quote, "Any database that collects detailed location information about Americans not suspected of crime raises very serious privacy concerns." The ACLU Stanley concludes, "It's unconscionable that technology with such far-reaching potential would be deployed in secrecy. People might disagree about exactly how we should use such powerful surveillance technologies, but it should be democratically decided. It shouldn't be done in secret." In the wake of the tragic events in Ferguson, Missouri, and elsewhere, where police were reported to have killed unarmed African Americans in the course of street patrols and other law enforcement activity, policymakers across the country have increasingly called for the use of police body cameras. This is a new way of recording police interactions with the public. The idea was that if these interactions were observed, they were more likely to occur in a lawful and appropriate manner. In other words, we think that surveillance of the police might make the authorities' performance better, a classic case of watching the watchers. In highly charged circumstances, the recording of law enforcement interactions with the public might just as readily support the contentions of police officers, who sometimes perform their jobs under fraught conditions. So, body cameras are proliferating around the country. Large cities, including New York and Washington, were buying them, as were smaller communities. Some estimates project that 10% of the police nationwide might soon end up wearing body cameras. And we already see anecdotal evidence that the video record is helping to resolve the he said, she said disputes between the police and private citizens. In New Mexico, for example, a police helmet camera captured the fatal police shooting of a knife-armed homeless man as he was turning away, demonstrating an instance in which the police likely seemed to have overreacted. Conversely, in Salina, Texas, 2 cameras told different tales of the arrest of a man high on heroin and helped to resolve a dispute over whether the officer had used excessive force. One camera was on the police car's dashboard, and from its vantage, the officer's takedown of the suspect might have been viewed as excessive. But the body camera revealed a much different view. The suspect threw a punch at the officer in an attempt to escape, and only then was dragged to the ground. "I think the future of policing is transparency," said City Police Chief Mark Medker afterwards. "Let's be as transparent as possible. We have nothing to hide." And indeed, researchers from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Criminology have published a study showing that not only do the cameras protect the public from the police, but the cameras also protect the police from the public. In Rialto, California, reports of police use of force fell by 59% after local officers wore body cameras for a year. And there was an even more significant drop in public complaints against the police, which declined by 87% compared to the previous year. Thomas Jefferson once advised that whenever you do a thing, act as if all the world were watching. Body cameras make this a reality. Now, some privacy issues will still exist, and rules about protecting both witnesses and the police must be established and tested. For example, should officers be required to have their cameras on whenever they talk to a citizen? Or are there exceptions? What about if they're talking to an assault victim or a child? How about if they're talking to an undercover informant? And if the encounters turn out not to be of interest, how long should the police department retain the video? If police respond to a domestic assault but bring no charges, should they delete the record immediately? Or should they retain it as potential evidence in case the next incident at the same house turns violent? And what about the law enforcement officer's own privacy? Should he or she be able to turn off the cameras when on break or in the restroom? You get the idea. There are lots of questions. So let's pull all the pieces together now. New York's Lower Manhattan Security Coordination Center is operated by the New York Police Department. It monitors more than 6,500 security cameras south of Canal Street, which is the northern boundary of the area that broadly encompasses Wall Street and the New York City Hall complex. Some of these cameras are fixed. Others are mobile. In many cities, police cameras are not connected to a central feed. But New York's cameras are networked, so that they are viewable in real time by officers in the Lower Manhattan Security Coordination Center. In other words, they are centrally monitored, watched, analyzed, and responded to. The project uses feeds from private and public security cameras, so that the information is collected not only from the city's own cameras, but also from department stores and office building CCTV. And all of it is monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The New York Police Department also makes use of license plate readers, which capture more than 2 million license plates in the area every day. Other sensors available to the police measure radiation, chemical releases, biological contaminants, and explosives. And all of that data also gets fed into the central monitoring system. Apart from this, New York police also have a variety of electronic databases at their disposal. These include arrest records, complaints, like when you call for a domestic violence dispute but no arrest is made, 911 calls, parking summonses, and vehicular moving violations. The Lower Manhattan Security Coordination Center aggregates digital copies of all of this information into a single database. More than 1.5 billion data points from records and sensors have been collected. And new 911 calls are added every 3 seconds. New complaint records 3 times a day. This $150 million initiative even includes automatic roadblocks that can be used to stop traffic in an emergency. So what does the system actually do? It processes 1.5 billion records and issues alerts as they are triggered. And when the system issues these alerts, the police react. For example, the radiation sensors sound an alarm whenever they identify a dangerous isotope, no matter what the amount. For license plate readers, the alarm is triggered by a match to a watch list of license plates that have been stolen or used in a crime, or for which there is some other lookout. Certain 911 calls, such as a suspicious package report or gunfire near a federal building, trigger alarms as well. With these data sources and alerts, the police track cars and people moving through the 1.7 square miles of Lower Manhattan. And they employ face recognition and object detection technology as well. The system can, for example, predict that a particular car will typically leave Manhattan outbound through the Holland Tunnel on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Or that another car will routinely enter Manhattan through the Brooklyn Bridge and then leave 20 minutes later via the Holland Tunnel to New Jersey. The system can also identify unattended packages that have been left behind and been motionless for a fixed period of time. Police personnel individually review these alerts, and only if an analyst confirms that there's a reason for concern are police assets dispatched to deal with the issue. In other words, whatever the source of the alert, the NYPD first assesses the information and then decides whether or not to act, and if they act, in what way. New York is not insensitive to the privacy concerns about this program. It has data storage rules, for example, that require deletion of some data after a fixed period of time, typically 30 days. The city also has an audit function to track the use of the system so that it's applied only to legitimate public safety issues. Compared to what came before it, this system represents a significant upgrade in analytic capacity and capability for the NYPD. Reflecting the new technology and tenor of our times, it very likely is also the wave of the future. So, what do you think of it?